r/AskReddit by Redmond Dts. Have you heard a dying person's last words? If so, what were they? My mom was in a lot of pain. I told her it was okay to go. She told me, "Okay, I love you." She passed a few minutes later, holding the hands of her 2 children. My only regret is not being around to see you become a grown man. My dad, colon cancer. I was 15. I love you, man. Goodbye. Said to me by a close friend that leukemia took out in the 80s. I had the privilege to hold his hand as he passed. Messed 15-year-old me up for a while. My child said, "I love you too." Too many. I worked 911 for many years. Perhaps the worst was along the lines of, "I just want to be sure someone will find my body before my kids get home." Caller hung herself. My brother, sister and father were all gathered around my mother at the end, and she opened her eyes and asked for a hug. Her last words were, "Give me a hug." We all hugged her, and she closed her eyes, and that was it. Screw cancer. A lady I cared for, she was 101. Before she passed, she began smiling and said, "They are here for me." I asked her who, and she waved and said it was her sister and her mother. She went peacefully back home with them not long after. It was a complete stranger online. His last words before the DM went quiet were begging me to never forget that he'd existed and that he'd loved playing the violin before severe depression took it from him. He said there was no one else left to remember him or those things, and he was so scared he'd be forgotten, like he'd never even been there. I still remember, and will always remember you, Rob, and you did exist. Edit. I went back and read the log of the conversation for the first time in almost 9 years. We only spoke for maybe 20 minutes, he was already fading by the time we spoke. There are a lot more details shared in that short time that I will hold back from sharing because of the nature of them being upsetting in very specific ways. I was, however, reminded that he was the source of a phrase that bounces through my head frequently. His last message was only 4 words. "I only wanted love." My dad's last words were bloopy bloopy, which he would say to my nieces and nephew, his grandkids. Let things be as they are, from a 112-year-old woman I cared for in a private nursing home. She kept spitting out her pills and told me that she died 24 hours later. Edit to add, she was nonverbal for years before she said that to me. I'm a retired firefighter medic, so I've heard a lot, a whole lot. But the one I remember the most was my grandfather. I was the only one with him in the hospital. He was in and out of consciousness and not very lucid. Then, he opened his eyes, looked at me, and said, "We had a hell of a time, didn't we, son?" And then he died. My grandfather raised me, and he was like a father-grandfather best friend rolled into one for me. And yes, in the 30 years I knew him, we did have one hell of a good time. My dad died earlier this year of lung cancer and subsequent respiratory failure. He said a lot of stuff in his last couple days because he was still with it in the head. But in his last hours, he got really bleak and was in and out of consciousness. He woke up one time and said, "Where am I? Oh, I'm back here," and seemed to be slipping between this place and the next. Then he looked at me and said, "Just let me go." He fell back asleep and didn't wake up that time. Retired paramedic, have heard hundreds of last words. Many are what you'd expect, help, no, etc. Maybe one of my favorites was a woman who had a brain bleed out of nowhere. Her boyfriend called because she wasn't acting right and was throwing up. She was unconscious by the time we got her to the ER, but she was not making sense when we were evaluating her. That's just my boyfriend, he poisoned me again, and, here, take this, they'll rob me in the hospital, as she took like $2,000 out of her bra and tried to hand it to me. One that wasn't a person's last words, but very well could have been. I don't want to die thinking about major pain after I made a bad joke to a pretty critical trauma patient. They were laughing as they said it though, so I'll count it as a win. Wife said, "I love you." Father-in-law said, "It's so beautiful." Mother-in-law said, "I'm ready." The last thing I heard my father-in-law whisper was, "Not yet." My late husband. One of the last things he said to me was, "You are the reason." Just like that, out of the blue. From somewhere deep in the dementia, that sentence came through. I was in tears instantly, and it's one of my fondest memories. I work as a nurse for the elderly and hospice care, and this one time, an old woman told me, "My husband is waiting for me," and she passed away that same night. I don't think I'm in the game plan. I was playing pickup basketball with a heavier middle-aged guy. He was on the other team, and I had to guard him. He was a nice guy I knew from the gym, but were never close with each other. He had all these young guys on the team that day. They kept chucking it up and never passed the ball to him. I was guarding him. After a while, it was obvious they were never gonna pass it to him. So jokingly, I said to him, "When are they going to pass it to you?" Then he chuckled and said it. Just after our exchange, the game ended. As he walked off the court, he collapsed of a heart attack and died. My father died in my arms with my mom standing next to us. He was going through in-home physical therapy when his heart gave out. My mom put her hand on his face and asked him, "Do you know who I am?" He whispered, "Juliet." They were married for 56 years, and his last word was her name. My aunt was passing from cancer at 33 and had been in a coma for about 2 weeks. She was living her final days at home. It just so happened that my family, my parents, her brother and sister-in-law, and sister, decided to visit her that day. When everyone was around her on her bed, she stirred, opened her eyes wide, and raised her arms extended in front of her. She said, "It's so bright, I can't see the door," to which my mother replied, "You can do it, just reach for them. You're ready." She then made a motion of opening double doors, smiled, said "It's so beautiful," then closed her eyes. She passed about 30 seconds later. It was absolutely amazing. I hope I have the peace she had when she left. Also, screw cancer. Dad sat up, after taken off of life support, looked at everyone in shock, and said, "Wait, am I dying?" Then laid back down. Can't shake that. Not exactly their last words, but the last words that she heard. So it was my turn to say goodbye to my mom. I held her hand and thought about what to say for a couple minutes. I was 15 at the time. And I just said, "I love you, mommy, I promise I will be okay." And right as I finished my sentence, she took her last breath and opened her eyes for the first time in days, looking right into mine. It was really special. I think about that promise often. Watched my father die of cancer when I was 16. When he was healthy, after he would fart, he'd say, "There's a kiss for ya." It always made me and my younger brother laugh. On his deathbed, he was unconscious, but he let out a big long fart. The "there's a kiss for ya" was implied. Yes. You motherfucker. My aunt, who was in the middle of cussing out my uncle, had a stroke, fell to the ground, and died before the ambulance could arrive. My best friend said, "I'm sorry bro," while he was losing consciousness from a brain bleed. He apologized for me having to stay with him in our hotel room while we were on holiday. That left some scars. My grandfather had lost the ability to speak in the last days, but the last thing he wrote was, "We have a wonderful family." I think about this a lot when I struggle with life's periodic struggle. My mom just spoke a lot of gibberish, was very confused. My grandpa's last words to me were, "See you later, Lloyd." My name is not Lloyd. Who is Lloyd? My grandpa's brother that died in the 60s. Long-time hospice professional. My only word of advice related to this is not to rely on your deathbed to say what you need to say. I can remember very few last words of any of my patients, despite being present many times. Confusion, lethargy, and other symptoms very often get in the way of clear communication, hours to weeks before death. That's all folks. Thank you for watching. If you like videos like this one, why not like and subscribe for more? Have a nice evening.